They laughed at my boots. They didn't know one of the richest men in the county was sitting 5 feet away. They didn't know he would risk his own fortune to save my family. They didn't know he would take down a sheriff wearing a badge and a lie. And they had no idea my father had died, protecting a secret buried right under our farm. I'm an old man now, but I still keep 2 pairs of boots on a shelf in my barn. My grandson always asks me why. So let me tell you what happened. All of it. Start to finish. I was 16. My father had been dead 3 years, thrown from a horse on land that wasn't. Even his, all I had left of him were his boots, cracked at the toe, a size too big. I stuffed rags in them so they wouldn't slide off my feet. One Saturday, I wore them into town. The store was warm and crowded, smelling of flour and coffee. I was almost to the counter when I heard my name. "Would you look at that?" a rich boy said. His name was Charlie Sutton. He'd never worked a day in his life. "Those were your father's boots, weren't they?" I kept walking. I thought if I didn't answer, it would end. It didn't. "Guess you can't afford your own," another boy said, louder this time, so the whole store could hear. A few grown men chuckled along with them. Not loud, just enough that I knew they'd heard, and enough that I knew they agreed. I looked down at the floorboards. My face burned. I remember wishing the ground would just open up and take me. My mother was at the counter buying flour and a small bottle of medicine. She heard every word. She didn't turn around. She didn't raise her voice. She finished paying, took my hand, and said, "Come on, son. We're going home." Outside, I asked her why she never fought back when people said things like that. "Because arguing doesn't put bread on the table," she said. "And because someday, son, the truth argues for itself." I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. What neither of us knew was that a man had been sitting quietly by the stove that whole time, watching, saying nothing. His name was John Black, and he was about to change everything. John Black was one of the richest men in the county. You'd never have known it to look at him. Old hat, plain wool coat, boots that had seen every kind of weather. I didn't learn this until years later, but John knew exactly what it felt like to stand where I'd stood. His own father had been a hired ranch hand his whole life. Worked another man's cattle, slept in another man's bunkhouse, and died owning nothing but a saddle and a name nobody remembered past the funeral. John had been laughed at, too, once. Patched trousers, boots with holes in them, same as mine. He remembered exactly how it felt to stand in a room full of people who thought less of you because of what you didn't have. He made himself a promise as a boy. If he ever had anything, he would never let a child of his feel that kind of shame. Watching me walk out that door brought all of it back, sharp as the day it happened to him. He didn't say a word to anyone. He just sat there a while longer, turning something over in his mind. Then he stood up and walked to the counter. "Mr. Brown," John said, "I'll take your strongest pair of winter boots, for a boy about 16, tall for his age." Brown wrapped them, without asking questions. That was one thing about John Black. People didn't usually ask him questions. "Should I send these out to the Carter place?" Brown asked anyway. "No," John said. "Keep them here." "Should I tell the boy they're waiting?" "Not yet." Brown frowned, but he set the box under the counter and said nothing more. Why would a rich man buy boots for a boy he'd never spoken to, and then hide them? I didn't find out the answer for a long while. But the next day, John rode out to our farm, and my mother's whole world tilted sideways when she saw him coming up the road. She figured he wanted to buy our land. Rich men didn't usually ride out to see poor widows for any other reason. "Mr. Black," she said, standing square in the doorway before he'd even climbed down, "if you've come about the farm, I'm not selling." "I haven't come about the farm," John said, taking off his hat. "I hear you're good with horses. Better than most with a needle and thread. I need someone at my ranch who can manage both." My mother's chin lifted. "We don't need charity." "Good," John said, "because I'm not offering any I'm offering a job. There's a difference, and I expect you know it better than most folks in this county. I watched my mother's face change right then. That single sentence earned something from her that money never could have. She took the job. And not long after, I started riding out to John's ranch after school, to help however I could. I had no idea what I was about to learn there. The work was harder than I expected. By the third week, my hands were a mess of blisters, and I'd taken to hiding them whenever. John walked past. One afternoon, I was trying to mend a broken gate when the hammer slipped and caught the side of my hand. I bit down and kept working. "You're bleeding," John said behind me. "It's nothing," I said, not looking up. He took my hand anyway and turned it over. Nothing doesn't make a man hide his hands. I didn't know what to say to that. He walked off, then came back with a strip of clean cloth. "Wrap it. If I stop, the gate won't get fixed today." He looked at me a long moment. "The gate can wait 10 minutes, son. Your hands can't." That was the first time I understood John Black wasn't just watching how hard I worked. He was watching whether I knew the difference between being strong and wearing myself down to nothing. A few weeks later, he watched something else. One of the ranch horses, an old mare named Dusty, caught her leg in a wire fence and tore it open, badly. Two of the hired men wanted to put her down right there, said she wasn't worth the trouble of healing. I wouldn't let them. I sat with that horse 3 nights running, cleaning the wound, keeping her calm, sleeping in the hay beside her. Stall so she wouldn't be alone. She healed. She limped a little afterward, but she healed. John never said much about it at the time, but I noticed he started looking at me differently after that. One evening, not long after, he told me to ride into town with him. Mr. Brown handed him a box across the counter. I opened it. My boots. The same ones John had bought weeks before and hidden away. "I can't pay for these," I said. "You don't have to," John told me. "You already earned them," I thought, standing there. That this was the end of the story. A poor boy gets new boots from a kind man. It was only the beginning. Around that same time, strangers started showing up in town. City men in city suits, asking the railroad agent about routes into our valley, asking the land office who owned what along the river. Nobody thought much of it. Men like that passed through every so often, chasing one scheme or another, John noticed. He made it his business to notice things like that. One night at the saloon, he caught 2 words through the noise of the room, spoken low, meant to be private. Black River. He didn't think much of it. Not yet. The name meant nothing to him. He had money sitting in a dozen ventures he barely remembered. A freight line, a bank, a mining claim that never paid a dime. He'd signed the papers years ago through his lawyer in Fort Worth and moved on with his life. He had no idea that name was about to turn everything he thought he knew about himself upside down. It was only a few days later that Sheriff Tom Reed rode out to our farm and everything changed. "You're behind on your property taxes, Mrs. Carter," he said, handing my mother a folded notice. "Several months' worth. 30 days or the county takes the land." My mother read it twice. Her hands weren't steady. "That's not possible," she said. "I paid every season on time without fail. I have the receipts right here." She went inside and brought out a tin box, laying my father's careful records on the porch rail for the sheriff to see. He barely glanced at them. "Those papers don't matter now." "They matter to me," she said, and I heard her voice sharpen in a way I'd rarely heard before. "My husband built this farm with his own 2 hands." 30 days, Reed said again, and turned his horse without another word. That night, my mother sat me down at the table. "Your father built this place from nothing," she said. "I won't lose it to a piece of paper." I reached across and took her hand. "Then we'll fight to keep it." "But how do you fight a man wearing a badge?" I told John everything the next morning. Out by the fence line, my voice shaking more than I meant it to. He rode into town that same afternoon and asked to see the county ledger himself. What he found troubled him plenty. My mother's tax payments, faithfully recorded every year, had simply vanished from the book the very season my father died. No mistake, no smudge. Erased clean. Then he found something worse. 3 other small farms in our valley had been seized by the county in the past 2 years. All of them modest. All of them strung along the same stretch of river. That wasn't bad luck. That was a plan. Find out who's buying this land once the county takes it, John told his foreman, Sam Miller. I want names. The answer Sam brought. Back would change everything John thought he knew about himself. Every seized farm, it turned out, had been bought up cheap by the very same company, Black River Oil. John went still when he heard it. That was the name from the saloon. He sent a wire to his lawyer in Fort Worth that same afternoon, asking for the company's full ownership papers. 2 days later, the answer came back. He owned the controlling share. He always had. He'd simply forgotten. The way a man forgets loose change sitting in an old coat pocket for years. The company stealing our land belonged to him. He sent Sam out to the river to look closer, and what Sam found there made the whole thing make sense at last. Strangers camped by the water, surveying tools laid out, measuring the ground with more care than anyone would ever give ordinary dirt. There was oil buried deep beneath our valley, a rich seam of it, and our farm sat squarely over the richest part. The scheme was simple, and it was cruel. Fake the debts, seize the farms, buy them cheap, let the company drill for a fortune. Sheriff Reed got paid to make it all look legal, one family at a time, so nobody would ever connect the pieces. John sat with that truth a long while. He could take our land that very week and never break a single law doing it. But he thought of a boy standing silent while grown men laughed at his father's boots. He thought of his own father, dying with nothing but a saddle and a name. I spent my whole life making sure no child of mine would ever feel that kind of shame, he told himself. I'm not going to stand by and watch another boy carry it. He made his decision that night. It was final. My mother would not lose her home. Reed found out someone was asking questions about him, and he didn't take it quietly. He rode back to our farm with 2 deputies at his back. My mother was hanging wash on the line when they arrived. You've got until Friday, Reed told her. Be gone by then, or we'll move you out ourselves. She didn't back down, but I saw her hand tighten on the clothesline rope, and I stepped between her and the sheriff before I even decided to. Reed's eyes dropped to my boots. New, sturdy, plainly not something a poor widow's boy could buy on his own. Well, well, he said, a slow smile crossing his face. Looks like you found yourself a rich friend, boy. Mr. Black gave me a job, I said, steadier than I felt. I earned these. Those boots won't save your farm. No, a voice said behind him. But the truth might. None of us had heard John ride up. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard, hat low, eyes fixed square on the sheriff. Reed's smile disappeared like it had never been there. The night before the hearing, John came by one last time. He found my mother sitting on the porch steps, twisting her apron in her hands. Do you trust me? He asked her. She looked up at him a long moment. Yes. Then tomorrow bring every paper your husband ever kept. That night my mother opened the old wooden trunk in her room, the one she hadn't touched since the funeral. Beneath my father's folded Sunday coat she found a letter neither of us had ever seen. It was written in his own hand, years before he died. Men had come to our farm once, he wrote, offering to buy the mineral rights beneath our land for almost nothing. He'd turned them down flat. He didn't much care, he wrote, what might be buried under that dirt. The land itself was worth more than any money, because one day it would belong to his son. My mother pressed a hand over her mouth, and I saw tears standing in her eyes that she didn't bother wiping away. He'd known. all along, years before any of us understood why it mattered. My father had stood his ground and protected something he never lived to see. The courthouse was packed the next morning, every bench full. Even the families whose sons had laughed at my boots were there, certain a poor widow stood no chance. Reed presented his false records first. Calm, confident, sure of himself. Then John stood. He laid my mother's real receipts on the table, one by one. Beside them, the county's own ledger, showing exactly where those payments had been struck from the record. Then bank papers, linking Sheriff Reed to a string of land purchases made under another man's name. Reed's confidence began to crack. Then John laid down my father's letter and read it aloud to the whole silent room. Proof that this same scheme had been tried once before, years earlier, and had failed the first time only because one stubborn man said no. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. Reed tried one last move. "The oil company wants that land," he said. "There's nothing anyone can do about it." John looked slowly around the room. "You're right." Reed smiled, thinking he'd won. Then John reached into his coat and set a document on the judge's desk. "There is one problem, Sheriff." Reed's smile faded. John looked him dead in the eye. "You spent the last 2 years stealing land for a company I own. Nobody in that room so much as breathed." John turned to face the crowd. "Black River Oil belongs to me." The room erupted in gasps. Reed's face went the color of ash. "I could take this land and make a fortune," John said. "I won't. This family fought for it once already, long before I was ever part of this. They deserve to keep it." He turned and handed my mother a signed agreement, a generous yearly payment for drilling rights. The land itself, our home, would remain ours, guaranteed, forever. By the end of that week, Sheriff Tom Reed had lost his badge. Judge Wilson ordered a full investigation into fraud, and the businessmen who'd quietly backed him melted away from town gossip like morning frost in the sun. The same boys who had laughed at my father's boots couldn't meet my eyes on the street anymore. I didn't feel like celebrating. I just stood beside my mother outside that courthouse, quiet and proud, and let it all settle over me. "You could have taken everything," my mother told John. "I already have enough," he said simply. Then he looked at me. "Your son reminded me of a promise I made myself a long time ago, that I'd never let a boy stand where I once stood and feel ashamed of it." My mother's eyes filled. "My husband would have thanked you." "I think he'd have been proud of his son," John said. "He was protecting this land for you both long before either of us ever showed up. Years passed the way they always do. Our farm grew strong. I grew into a man. And in time I earned a small ranch of my own. Every acre of it, the same way I earned that first pair of boots. I never forgot where I came from. My father's old cracked boots still sit in a wooden box in my barn. Right beside them, the boots John gave me that fall, worn soft now with age. My own son asked me once why I kept 2 pairs. I touched the old ones first. "These remind me where I came from. My father protected everything we had, long before I ever understood what he was protecting." Then I touched the newer pair. "And these remind me that a kind man once believed I could go somewhere. Because he'd once stood exactly where I was standing. The people who laughed at me that cold morning thought they were laughing at a poor boy in old boots. They didn't know I was carrying my father's memory with every step I took. They didn't know the quiet man by the stove was about to change my whole life. I learned something that year I've never forgotten. The greatest kindness isn't money. It's the chance to stand on your own 2 feet. If you've ever been judged for what you didn't have instead of who you were, you're not alone. Tell me about it in the comments. I'd like to hear it. And if this story reminded you of someone who once believed in you when no one else did, take a moment today and tell them what that meant. You may not have grown up with much, but you were never worth less because of it. you still matter.